Hey everybody, welcome to ARE Live. I'm Mark Tier, the founder of Black Spectacles, and today we'll be covering programming and analysis. Using a mock exam, we're going to cover several topics in this division of ARE 5.0. Mike has put together, we were just talking about it a few minutes ago, 5 or 6 good questions are going to cover a couple of the key topics in this exam. So when you walk away, you should have, a good sense of some of the things that are going to be on the exam, some of the topics. At our next ARE Live broadcast, we're going to discuss project planning and design with Mike. And we'll once again use a mock exam to cover some of the issues related to that exam, relating to, evaluating design alternatives and a variety of other issues. So definitely register for that if you go to our website. If you go look up podcasts, I believe there's a link up there right now. You can register for that guy. A couple of updates to our products. So you may have heard that Black Spectacles is the first ever NCARB approved test prep provider for all 6 of the exams. And that approval applies to all of our study materials, which include video lectures, practice exams, and flashcards. I often will remind folks about our group coaching program, which is really good for folks who are looking for support and structure while studying. You can actually go to our group coaching website and sign up for one of the wait lists for our 2020 sessions. I believe the one, I think we just closed the one that starts in December, but we have one starting in February. So you can actually sign up for that wait list, and then you'll be notified when registration opens. And as I always like to tell people, if you'd like your boss to pay for your Black Spectacles membership, be sure to tell them about our firm licenses for firms of any size, whether you're 10 or 10,000 people. We have all kinds of options. You can visit blackspectacles.com/firms to learn more about those. And I just dropped a link to register for that. Actually, we for the demo, we often do a demo. And so one of the things that we like to invite people, if they want to learn more about how that works, and get a demo of that, you can choose to register for that, and we just dropped a link for that in the chat box. Lastly, we have a special discount on Black Spectacles individual memberships, so we'll provide a coupon code for that at the end of the show. And then one of the fun things about today is that for those of you listening live, we'll be tracking your answers, and everyone who gets all of the questions right will get a free Black Spectacles t-shirt. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully we'll give away, I don't know, I wonder what the high mark is for how many t-shirts we've given out. It's probably like 10?
No, we gave out like 20 some once.
You think so?
Yeah, like 21 or something like that.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, cool. So anyways, we'll be doing that. And of course, that's Mr. Mike Newman. If you don't know Mike, he's a senior lecturer at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as the founder of Shed Studio, and he is our instructor for Black Spectacles online ARE exam prep lectures. So thanks for joining us today, Mr. Mike. And as always, today we'll be taking your questions using the GoToWebinar question box. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mike.
Okay, so as Mark said, we're going to be talking about programming and analysis, and a kind of quick background to this. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows already, but just to kind of start the conversation off, the programming analysis is essentially before any design work happens. It touches on the kind of early design work you might do, kind of early schematic design, that kind of thing. But mostly it's about the research phase. It's about the period where you're setting up the contracts with the clients. It's about kind of all of that stuff that we used to refer to as pre-design back in the old days of the old exam. But now they're referring to it as the programming and analysis. So it's all of those analysis issues. What does the site look like? What is the zoning like? What is the financial milieu like? What is the context like? What's the relationship to the owner? What's the contract like? What's the project delivery method? It's all that stuff that you're setting up for the future of the project, and you're about to get into the main sort of design thrust of the project. So let's just jump in. These questions are meant really just to sort of kind of touch on a couple of different topic areas so that you can kind of see the kinds of things that we're talking about and have a little bit of an opportunity to kind of talk about them around the various issues. So we'll try to touch on a few extra little bits and pieces as we go along. And a quick reminder, especially for those that don't win the t-shirt, This is me just writing up some questions to kind of be able to get across a certain set of conversations. These are not perfect questions by any means, so if it's my fault that you didn't get the T-shirt, I take full responsibility, so sorry about that.
I'm sure you have like
Okay.
6 or 7 of them or something probably in your closet.
I
so
do have a few.
You guys can find them at the next
Right,
AIA convention.
right. You can always steal one from me next to AIA convention. Okay, so number one. Some of these questions are a little quicker and faster, and some are a little wordy. And I did that specifically because I was re-looking through some of the NCARB examples, and they really range. Some of them are surprisingly wordy, and so I thought I would kind of mimic that on a couple of these. But remember, they have to be relatively easy because you have to be able to answer them pretty quickly. All right, number one. The client has an existing single-family house in an upscale residential neighborhood. Currently, the client drives in on a driveway from the front street and parks in an open parking pad in the rear of the site. They have expressed interest in building a freestanding garage, but on first inspection of the zoning code, you note that there is a rear setback of 40 feet. What can you suggest to your client? So possible answers we have: A, ask the zoning department for a change in zoning in the zoning district in order to be allowed to build in the rear setback area. B, explain that the rear setback does not allow building anything in the rear 40 feet of the property, and that therefore you should look into building the garage in the side yard and connecting directly to the house. C, request a community meeting to review with the neighbors to see if they would object to the client building a garage in the rear area mentioned. And D, the setback restriction typically refers to primary use. A garage would be considered an accessory use and therefore could be built in the rear setback. So a couple of things. Let's run through some of these issues. First of all, everybody understands the concept of the setback. If I have a property and that let's see here. Whoa. Okay. Well, I'm not going to draw it. I'm making something disappear here.
It's back now.
All right. We're just going to go without drawing it. If I have a property pretty much anywhere in the country, zoning codes can be slightly different. So there won't be anything overly specific about zoning codes on the exam, but there are certain things that are pretty much true across the board. One of them is the concept of districts. So the districts is going to be a way to define different parts of the city. You have residential districts and business districts and commercial districts and et cetera, et cetera. And each of those will have a set of different rules and regulations about them. And one of those sets of rules and regulations is going to be the setbacks. And so a place that is really residential focused is likely to have a rear yard setback of a certain number of feet. It might be 20, 30, 40, 70 feet, depends on the kind of scale of the neighborhood and different things going on. It's also likely to have side yard setbacks, and the side yard setbacks sometimes will be a couple of feet, sometimes will be 5 feet, things like that, especially in a residential neighborhood. And the side yard setbacks make sure that there's air able to get and light able to get to all the windows that come up, so that all of these different houses in the residential setting can have ease of kind of that light and vent happening. So the side yard setbacks have this very specific kind of quality to them. If we were in a commercial district, if there was some kind of business kind of area that we're talking about, like a place where there's a lot of storefronts or something like that, it's very unlikely that you would have a side yard setback. The likelihood that they would force you to have an open space between stores that front to a sidewalk would be pretty unlikely. So you can see how the concept of the setbacks is there to reinforce the different ideas of the different neighborhood districts. Similarly, if I have a front yard setback, almost always, if it's a 0 front yard setback, that means that's a commercial district. That's a big commercial district. So storefronts will want to be right on the sidewalk. larger buildings that maybe multi-story, multi-family kinds of structures, those may want to be right on that sidewalk, that zero setback. But single-family houses are much more likely to be sort of required to be set back away from the street, and it sets a tone. It has a place for kids to play. It gives you that sort of sensibility. So the zoning codes are these weird devices because what they're doing, the point of what they're doing, is trying to reinforce an idea about how buildings should work in a specific neighborhood. So you want family oriented, well then you're going to have certain kinds of setbacks and certain kinds of scale limitations. You want to increase the excitement of a commercial neighborhood, well then I'm going to have a zero setback and I'm going to have everything right cheek to jowl, right? The way that this gets expressed is through this zoning code and through the setbacks. So it's kind of funny, right? Because the setbacks are these like very weird, like simple little, okay, you have to set the building back 40 feet or 2 feet from the side. So it's these very strange little, like, why that number thing. But what they're doing is they're setting up this sort of very sense of how the neighborhood works, right? So it's this very evocative quality that's playing out through these very straightforward numbers. So back to the answers here. Let's look at answer C. Request a community meeting to review with neighbors. Yeah, great idea. Always a good idea to have the community on your side. That's not really a plausible answer in this context, though. So I'm going to say no to C. How about ask the zoning department for a change in zoning in the zoning district in order to be allowed to build in the rear setback area? That's certainly a possible answer. My guess is it's probably a little over the top because it's just a big deal to ask for a change in the zoning district. But, maybe that might be one of the possibilities. So let's look at B. Explain that the rear setback does not allow building in the rear 40 feet, and then suggest that putting the garage in the side yard. That's also sort of plausible. Depending, you'd have to know more about the site really to be able to say if that's a good idea or not. We don't have any more information about the site, so it's a little hard to know, but it's sort of plausible. So A and B, kind of plausible. Let's take a look at D. D, the setback restriction typically refers to the primary use. A garage would be considered an accessory use and therefore could be built in the rear setback. Yeah, this is one of those tricky things about how the codes work, especially the zoning code. When it says you can't build anything in the side yard or in the front yard or in the rear yard, there's actually quite a lot that you can build in those places, and those are accessory aspects to the primary use. So in most situations, you're not going to be able to build, say, and this is a single family house, I couldn't build another single family house in the rear yard because that would be conflicting with the primary use. I'd have two primary uses and one of them would be in the restricted area. But the garage is considered accessory. It's helping that primary use. Same thing with like maybe a pergola or a deck or something along those lines. There may be other restrictions about where you can place those, for fire restrictions or certain height restrictions, other things like that. But elements that are accessory to the primary use are not necessarily restricted from the setbacks. So all of that to say, the point of the zoning code, the point of the setbacks is for the government to be able to have an opinion about how different neighborhoods should feel. And then your job is to sort of find a way to work the desire of the client into that understanding. If you can't do any of those things at all, then you would go back to A and say, we need to get the zoning changed. And then you could have a discussion/argument with the zoning department about whether that's a good idea. And they could say yes or no. But right off the bat, I'm going to say that D is the answer, because that's the sort of best, clearest understanding of the situation, which is this difference between primary use and accessory use. Again, remember, not all zoning codes are going to be the same across the country, but you get the idea of what they're looking for in these kinds of situations.
Okay, I guess that knocked out half of the people who submitted.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a weird one. Let's try number 2. A new client is considering hiring you for their new indoor soccer center for kids, teams, leagues, and parties to be located in an existing unused warehouse building. They have contracted you to help them with a feasibility study first. What should the architect study first? So one of the things you'll find when you get questions like this is that all of the potential answers are in fact potential answers. Every once in a while, something will be clearly not accurate and you can just throw it away. But almost all of the things will have some relationship to reality. And the question is not which is the right answer, which is the best right answer. And this is an example of that. So we have an existing warehouse. They're going to put kids' soccer league kind of indoor use inside of it. And before they do anything, they've asked you to look into it to help them do a feasibility study. The answers we have here are PUD, stormwater control system, catchment area, list of possible general contractors. Excuse me. PUD refers to a planned unit development. That's a situation where if there's a zoning situation where your client wants to do, let's say it's an old manufacturing district and you want to put in a whole bunch of townhomes or single family houses or something that's completely different and doesn't fit to the current zoning. The zoning department may have reasons to want to keep it to the current zoning and may say no, but one of the things you can do is you can write your own code where you say, all right, here's the zoning code we think makes sense for this. You present it to the zoning department. They look at it. They say, hey, we think this is a great idea. We don't think the manufacturing is coming back to that spot. So we think that we like this idea. We're going to back you, and then we will take it to the town council, city council, whatever governing body would then adopt it. They then vote on it. You might have to make presentations and do various things. They would vote on it, and if it goes through, then you have effectively changed the zoning code for that location. So the PUD is a way of making the zoning code match to your client's desires, but it has to go through an extensive process. The architect would be involved, lawyers would be involved, zoning specialists would be involved. So PUD is an interesting possibility. The idea of changing the use of these old manufacturing buildings and putting in this new use in, it's not a terrible thought to think that PUD might be part of that as a process, but it's a little unlikely that the PUD process itself would be actually used, and it's a little premature during the feasibility study to jump into it. So I'm going to say no to the PUD. Stormwater control system. Stormwater control system is certainly going to be something that comes up early and is important really everywhere around the country at this point. Flooding is a huge deal all over the place. The codes are all over it. And it would be certainly part of a feasibility, like, is this building viable? But it's not really a governing distinction. There are ways to deal with it. So it's a possible answer, but doesn't seem like a great answer to me. I'm going to skip to D, the list of possible general contractors. Another thing that might well be an interesting thing to think about, like it's not necessarily a bad idea to start thinking about who the possible people are that could work, but that's not truly a feasibility issue. It might be sort of a question of, are there people around who can do the work? Do we have to bring people in from some other location? But it's a little bit of a stretch. So then leaves us with C, catchment area. And this is one of those spots where if you haven't heard this term used in this way, this is why I'm bringing it up effectively, because the catchment is a terminology that gets used on the ARE, gets used in the guidebooks. It's used quite a bit. It's a very simple concept, but if it's not part of your normal parlance, it would be hard for you to know exactly what they mean. So catchment comes from the idea of like water control. So if you think of a catch basin, like say a catch basin in a parking lot, there'll be a certain portion of the parking lot that drains to that catch basin, right? Maybe there's a little mound and then the part on the other side of that mound drains to a different catch basin, right? So there's an area that drains to this one catch basin. That's called the catchment. So if it rains and it rains on that area, you know where that rainwater is going to go. That rainwater is going to go to that catch basin. And then from there, wherever it's going to go from there. So that terminology gets used for when you're doing feasibility studies. If they're going to do something, well, let's use a different example. Let's say a corner store. You're going to put in a little corner store, and before you do it, you might think, well, are there any people around who will go to this corner store? And I would think about what's the catchment of the area for the people who are going to go use this corner store. So, like, how far will people walk to go to a corner store? I don't know. What do you think? 4 blocks, 5 blocks, something like that. That seems kind of far to me, but maybe let's say 4 or 5
I'm sure
blocks.
both my wife and children would complain.
Yeah, bitterly if I to have to walk
Really?
5 blocks.
Really,
I got to
we're
go
walking?
5 blocks. But let's say let's say it's 5 blocks, and then if you did a aerial view and you looked and there wasn't any housing in that 5-block area. Maybe there's only 40 houses there. Well, 40 houses in the 5-block catchment area, like, that's just not believable as enough people to support that store. So your feasibility study would be saying, we studied the catchment area and there's just not enough people to support the store. You could imagine if you're talking about a shopping mall or something like that, or a big box store or something, the catchment area might not be a circle. Like, it might be along the lane of a highway or something where people would be willing to drive, from 10 miles away to come, but they're going to be willing to drive that 10 miles only if that's a fast road that's going to get them there. They're not going to drive 10 miles through backwoods. Like, there's going to be the shape will be different, but it's still a catchment area, right? It's still a way of thinking about where are the people going to come from. And before any real project is done, if it's a simple project, the study of the catchment area might be just a couple of people standing on the site saying, I wonder if people would come to this. Yeah, it looks like it would work. That would be a study of a catchment area. But for a more complicated thing, it might be that you would literally take a look, how many kids are in this neighborhood? Will people drive to this? You do a study whether parents are willing to drive their kids to these things. If they are, that how far of a distance will people drive? Therefore, where is the area that folks would come for their kids to go to this particular place? And are there enough kids to make this a viable experience? So that's what is this feasible? That's what a feasibility study is. Does it make sense? So this is exactly the kind of thing. There's bound to be a bunch of questions, not necessarily exactly like this, but questions that are about that research phase, and is this even a viable project, right? And that it's not really the architect's role to figure out whether it's a viable project, but often you are there to help the owner, help the client in making that evaluation. So in this case, that terminology, catchment area, it's just used a lot on this exam, so it's worth noting.
All right, sweet. We're down to 47, folks.
All right, here we go. Number 3, a new 10-story high-rise spec tenant office building is being planned. Which of the following is a likely building efficiency ratio for this structure? So the building efficiency ratio is the idea that, there's a number of different square footages that get involved. In fact, one of the things, let me just say, quick aside, I always hate it when people ask me a question about, like, well, what's the square footage? Because then I have to always go into the, like, oh, here we go. What square footage do you mean? Do you mean the gross square footage, which would be the overall square footage? Do you mean the rentable net square footage? Even rentable net square footage, there's like 3 different versions. There's like a New York version and a Boston version and I think an LA version. One goes to the window line, one goes to the paint line, things like that. If it's a condo, then everything is, that's the outside wall is not part of the condo. From the paint in is part of the condo, right? So just the simple idea of, well, what's the square footage is actually weirdly complicated. So just a little heads up about that. But then this question is about relating 2 of those different issues. And one of them is the gross square footage, which is the overall how much area does the whole building, each floor all added up, how much area is the overall, including everything, thickness of walls, columns, stairs, telephone rooms, whatever, utility spaces, including all of it, and then comparing that to the net area, which is the area that's actually usable by tenants. This is a spec office building, so what that means is they're going to want to have it be a reasonably efficient building efficiency ratio. So the areas that aren't part of the net in this case, well, it's going to be the elevators, it's going to be the columns for the building, it's going to be the corridor, the sort of circulation that's outside of a tenant space. It's going to be any of the building utility spaces, but not necessarily the utility spaces within a tenant space. That's probably part of their net space. Depends a little bit on the contracts. But so a typical building spec kind of high-rise building is going to be anywhere from the kind of high 60s up to about 80 something, 82, something like that. So 75 is a very good answer. 25 would be way too low of a efficiency and completely like you are never working for these people again. The only place you would see something like 25 is if it's like it's more of like it's meant to be a symbol of something and not an actually usable space. So every once in a while you'll see like a flagship store or something like that where it's super inefficient, but it doesn't really matter. What it's there for is for people to take selfies and put it on Instagram or whatever, and then like that's its job. And so then it can be less than efficient, but even that you wouldn't be doing a 25% efficiency. 50% efficiency is actually plausible in certain scenarios. You might see an efficiency rating for like a hospital of like 60%, 50%, but that's because the corridors are very different and they're used differently. And so it has a very specific set of understandings about the idea of efficiency. 99%, well, wow, that would be impressive. If you could make a building efficiency ratio of 99%, that means essentially every single aspect is rentable, which would be, your client would love you, but it's hard to imagine.
You can do that with air columns, right?
Yeah, air columns, yeah, magnets, electromagnet structural systems.
Yeah, piece of cake.
No problem. So 75 is just sort of a good kind of simple, plausible answer, and it's the only one out of the bunch that's really doable. Okay.
42.
Number 4. The Park District has hired you for a new environmental center in a beautiful and environmentally sensitive remote area of the park. They have supplied a survey, a wetland watershed information, and general topographic information. To make initial recommendations for the preliminary analysis of the site, what other information should the client provide? So, key thing here that I'm going to point out is should the client provide. This is one of those special aspects to this sort of early phases of this before you get into the design. It's important to kind of remember what everybody's roles are. And the client, when you're signing a contract with the client, in order for you to be able to understand what the actual project that you're signing on to is, they need to give you a bunch of information. And one of the things they need to give you is a survey, because that's the legal description of the site. And it shows that they understand the reach that they have, the place that they can work, and it gives you the realm in which you're going to be doing your work. Along with that, they would also be giving you information about the program, which isn't mentioned here, but could have been. Because if you don't have the program from the client, how do you know what you're designing? How are you going to be able to give them a reasonable fee if you don't have a very clear program? And the program is this especially weird one, because most young architects, when they go into this in the first couple of projects, sort of assume that they write the program. but in fact the program should be written prior to the contract, and that's in fact how you can make a contract, because you know what the client wants and therefore you can give them a price. There are other possible contracts where that's different. The client can hire you specifically either as an ad in the standard contract to do the program, or they can contract with you separately to do a program. So you often are involved, but technically that's something that the client brings to the architect. So the survey and the program, and then the other important thing that they bring is the geotechnical reports. So the answer here is going to be A, geotechnical reports. Now that sounds weird because it sounds like a very detailed kind of aspect. Like, isn't that just part of the structure? Like, shouldn't that be, you should be thinking about that down the road. But if you're thinking about the feasibility of a project and the kind of how it's going to get placed onto the site and the sort of early kinds of, first analysis kinds of issues, I would be very interested in the topographic information, which would be presumably part of the survey. It doesn't have to be part of the survey, but obviously you would get it in this kind of situation to be done as part of the survey or by surveyors. I'd be very interested in the topographic information, and I'd also be very interested in, like, where is the good soil that I can build on? Is there any good soil that I can build on? Do I have to reach down to bedrock before I can put any reasonable sized building? If I have to reach all the way down to bedrock, this may not be the best spot for a very environmentally sensitive place, right? So it's this kind of geotechnical soils information that the client typically would also be giving the architect early in the process as part of that kind of first run of information when you're first signing a contract, along with the survey, along with the program, and along with any environmental reports if there's anything like toxic materials or asbestos or lead paint or anything like that. That's also something that they should be giving to the architect. And then the architect, their job is to take that information and come up with a design intent, which is about ideas, it's about design, it's about working within these legal restrictions and these pieces of information about the site that the owner has given the architect. So the owner is giving the architect the site and the sort of legal idea of the site, and then the architect is coming up with a design intent that understands those sets of legal restrictions and creates a design idea, a design intent that can then be built by somebody else. And that somebody else would be the general contractor, and their job is the means and methods to actually build it. So everybody has these different roles, and you'll see on these kinds of questions them wanting to reinforce that you understand the different roles that all these different players have. I'm talking about here, all of my examples are, until the next one, are all pretty straightforward. Design, bid, build, which is the sort of standard way that these things are done. And if it's not really mentioned, then project delivery, you should assume, would be design, bid, build. But there are other ways to do it. You could be doing it design, build. You could be doing multiple prime. You could be doing integrated project delivery. There's a bunch of other ways these things can be done. And so it's important that you, if there's anything in the question that takes you to a different project delivery method, make sure you're using that system of analysis because it's a different set of contracts, it's a different set of relationships. Everything, if you are acting as the developer and the architect, well, then this whole conversation is quite different. But for a standard design, bid, build, this would be the logical answer. A couple of little quick responses to these other ones. The addenda list. The addenda list wouldn't happen until we actually were bidding out, and so we're too early in the process. We would have to be well into the construction documents before we would even get close to an addenda list. The meeting schedule would certainly be an important thing to know about, but it's not a driver, right? It's just the process of kind of how you're putting these things together. And feasibility study is also a good answer, but it's not necessary, especially in a situation like this where it's harder to understand what the feasibility would be of an environmental center in a remote portion of a existing park. Clearly, the park district would be having a reason to do this that may not be about efficiency, and so feasibility study just doesn't seem quite right. But geotechnical, that's going to be immediately right on the front burner, and absolutely something that the client should provide.
All right, looking good. We get 38 people going into the last question.
Rocket. Okay, number 5. And remember, again, this one, let me just say, this is sort of to make a point. So if I lose a couple of you, apologies. This is not a complicated question, but you do have to know what the term fast track means. So project delivery, like I was just talking about with design, bid, build, the concept of project delivery is this idea that you have to, before you can start designing, before you can really even make the contract between a client and an architect, before anything can happen, you have to have a conversation about what's the manner in which it's going to happen. Are there going to be construction managers involved? Is it going to be a typical design, bid, build? Is this really about design, build, and the architect and the builder are one entity, even if they are actually two different companies? But in this context, they can act as one entity by having a contract with each other, and therefore only one contract to the client. Right, that set of different project deliveries changes everything. It's a different set of contracts, it's a different timeline, it's a different set of liabilities, and so it's really important that the beginning of a project, during the programming and analysis phase, for example, the beginning of a project, that you've got a clear understanding of what the delivery method, the project delivery method, is going to be, because it literally alters every single thing. So fast track, what's fast track? Well, fast track is essentially, I always describe it as the stupidest of the project delivery methods. It's like just incredibly dumb. Like it's such a crazy, ridiculous idea. So what happens with a fast track? You as the designer, you're drawing out, you're developing what the foundation system's going to look like. And as soon as you have developed that, you hand those drawings over, and the contractors start, maybe there's a bidding phase, but essentially you hand it over to a contractor, and they start excavating and putting in the foundation. And then while they're doing that, you're figuring out, well, what's the overall structural skeleton of the building going to be, the steel or concrete skeleton of the building. And so you're figuring that out, you're drawing all that out, and once you're done, you hand that over. And now maybe there's a bid set, maybe not, but you're handing it over, and somebody's going to start taking that, and presumably the foundation's done, and they're going to start building the skeleton right on top of that brand new foundation. And while they're doing that, you're doing the skin of the building, and you're kind of going, well, et cetera, et cetera. You're doing it in these different packages. And the idea is that you're designing while they're building. And the reason I call this the stupidest possible project delivery method is, well, obviously there's going to be problems. You can't really foresee all of the spots where, in 3 months you're going to decide, oh, it'd be great to put a bathroom over here. I guess we should have put plumbing down below the slab underneath that area. Right, so the only way you're going to put that bathroom in is by going in and cutting that slab and putting that underneath the already built area. Obviously, this creates a lot of expensive fixes to the problem. So why on earth would anybody ever use fast track project delivery? And the obvious answer is, well, yeah, it may be stupid, and you may be spending a bunch of extra money, but maybe it's worth it. So where could it possibly be worth it? Well, let's say I've got a hard start. We've got, for whatever reason, the project doesn't start until January, and it has to be done by the following January. It's like, well, if it has to be done, then maybe you got to assume you're going to lose a little money on fixes because you got to get going. And so if it has a hard timeline, that's going to be one of the places where fast track becomes quite plausible and happens actually pretty regularly. Another example of where it happens quite a bit, it may be, let's say you're doing a high rise or something, and you have a very expensive lot, and you have carrying loans of millions and millions of dollars, and you can cut off, let's say, 1 year, like 12 months of time off of your project if you do it fast track. And the process of doing fast track, you sort of assume, all right, we're going to spend $300,000 on fixing mistakes. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe we're going to spend $300,000 fixing mistakes. But by saving the 12 months, maybe we save $600,000 in bank loan costs. Like, that's $300,000 well spent. We've just saved 300 grand by doing that. So even though it's crazy, there are situations where it makes sense. The reason I use fast track as an example, really the likelihood in your career, some percentage of you will come across, like I said, there are a bunch of fast track in specific situations, but most of the time you're going to be doing design, bid, build, construction managers, multiple prime. There's a bunch of project deliveries that are more likely, but fast track is a great one to ask questions about, which is why I put it on here, because you should definitely know, because it's an easy one, because it has such dramatic aspects to it that you can easily ask questions about it. So let's run through them. Single family house, yeah, that's, I could imagine a situation where I'm fast tracking it, but it just doesn't make any sense. The timeline, all of that, it's just not particularly important. Another one that I'm going to quickly take off is going to be the public library in a small town. Really, you're going to tell the administrators of the small town government that, yeah, we may spend an extra $300,000, but we'll get it done fast. Like, they're not going to care about it being that fast. It's just not appropriate for that kind of construction. So those two, scale-wise, it just isn't plausible. And then the other one that I'm going to say really isn't plausible, and this is maybe a little bit insider baseball, but a 16-unit affordable housing project in a suburban area. Again, it's just not likely that the speed of the project is going to be such a big concern that you would be so interested in pushing that speed that you're willing to go and do this sort of crazy fast track thing. Now, having said that, there are probably some listeners that are in California, and in California, you may be having a very different conversation because affordable housing is such a crazy situation there, and looking for ways to get it done as fast as possible. Plus, a lot of the suburban areas are actually pretty wealthy at this point and have a lot of money. So there may be parts of the country where that one doesn't fit right, but generally across the country, an affordable housing project in a suburban area, it's just not going to be fast tracked. So why the other three? So B, a high school in an urban area. Imagine you're running a high school, you're running a school district, and the school has to be done before a certain time when the folks are going to be coming in. It's like, what, you're going to find somewhere to house them for 3 months before the project gets done. It's a huge deal for the high school not to get done on time. It's a big cost. It's a big problem because the timelines are so key and important. So you'll often find in school construction, fast track, at least partial fast track gets used. C is essentially what I just referred to, which is in a very expensive area in a downtown. That means the carrying costs, the bridge loans, all of those things are incredibly expensive, and saving time, it may well make sense to get that rolling. And you actually often will see a kind of separate package contract for the excavation and foundation before the rest of the design is actually fully finished. Even if it's not all fast track, it's often at least partially fast track. And then for timeline reasons, again, stadium for a professional football team, you can't just say, oh, sorry, we won't be able to have any games here for 2 months. Like, you got to get it done, right? And so that's a place where fast track is likely to show up. So B, C, and F.
All right, here. Just looking here for a couple of questions. I think Felipe has an interesting question here. and I just lost his question. It went so fast. But I think his question was about actually about exam strategy, talking about this exam in particular, and whether this is sort of the beginning of the design process. Any thoughts on whether this is the one that makes the most sense to take first? I don't know if you have any opinions about that right now.
Yeah. So, back in the day when under 4.0 and 3.1 and all that before, when everything was siloed and you had like a structures exam and a site planning exam and et cetera, all these separate topics, there was a huge amount of crossover, of course, but still they were focused on separate topics. I actually thought that having a strategy about which exam to take first and second was really useful and important, and made a lot of sense. To be perfectly honest, in the way that they've structured 5.0, I actually don't think it matters all that much. And if it was me, I'd probably just do it in the order, do the first two, the project and practice management, and then I'd start with this one and just run through them in order. And I think I would do that because I think it allows you to sort of keep everything straight in your head about like where you are in the process. The key thing about that on these exams, the way 5.0 is done, is that you have to remember that the questions will often have answers in them that are reasonable answers, and maybe even the correct answer to the question if it was one of the other exams. So, like, for example, the PUD we had earlier in this, that it's just too early to have that at this point. There would have to be a lot more work done before that PUD would be a reasonable answer. There's a bunch of things that can be correct, but not in this moment of the timeline of the project. And so, to me, I would just keep it as simple as possible and go from 1 to 6. However, I think if you've got a game plan that you think is like maybe you've done a lot of construction experience where you've been working for a firm on a site and you have a lot of experience with that, well, maybe you want to start with that one because that'll give you a lot of confidence and you feel like you know a lot about it and it kind of gets you in. Great. That's a great way to make a decision. But it's just not like, when you talk to everybody in your office, they're all going to have these really strong opinions. But most of those folks probably did it under 4.0 or 3.1 or something. And it's just a different ball game under 5. And I just don't think I wouldn't over fret about it.
Yeah. The only thing that we've observed from some of the folks, especially in the coaching program, as maybe a second idea for a strategy is since PPD and PDD are so dense, and generally require a little more time, and they certainly the content is very there's a lot of overlap.
There's a huge amount of overlap. Yeah.
Some folks are actually taking those 2 exams last. And actually taking construction and evaluation as number 4.
I actually think that's a great idea because the other thing is that those 2 big ones, once you've taken all of the other ones, you're essentially prepping yourself for the 2 big ones. So I can totally imagine it. So that all that really is, though, is sliding the last one into the what's that? 4th? Fourth spot. So I think that's a great sort of twist to it that would make a lot of sense. And those 2 big ones are enormous, right? This one's pretty small and handleable, and the topic areas are pretty constrained, but those 2 big ones are enormous.
Mayosh has an interesting question. It says, I'm confused. Thought the fast track was a scheduling method, not a project delivery method.
So it's both. And the reason that it's a project delivery method, this is going to be a little sideways analysis, but clearly I'm not using standard contracts for a fast track, right? It's its own set of contracts. Clearly, we have a different set of relationships between the owner, the architect, and whoever the contractors are. It may, in fact, be multiple contractors. It may be one contractor. And what project delivery is effective. Like you could say, well, what project delivery is? It's which contracts are you using, right? That's a simple answer to what is project delivery. Like, well, I choose the contract, and that's going to define all of our relationships, and that's how the project is being delivered. So it's a weird one because it is a scheduling aspect, but also because the contracts are different, because the flow of information is different, because the relationships are all different, it becomes a project delivery method.
Okay, and then one more. Again, this is a broad.
There may
one.
be some people who treat that differently. There may be some guidebooks that say it slightly differently, but most will say it the way I just did.
Yep. And then lastly, from Craig, talking about struggling with test time and sort of managing your time during the test, says it seems impossible to actually finish on time. How do you recommend going faster? And I might actually change the question and say, how would you recommend managing your time better?
Yeah, so a couple of important aspects to the time management. One is remember that there's a relatively short per question time. And so you just do a quick calculation. You have X number of hours and X number of questions, and you can figure out, well, how many minutes do I have per question? And if you get into a situation where you're triple reading it and it's got a calculation and you're not really sure what to do and you're trying to sort of go back and forth and you're halfway through, you think, and you've already spent 4 minutes on it, like, guess and move on, right? Maybe put a star, go back to it, but like, you don't have to answer every single question correctly to pass this exam. So, don't overthink it. Like, if it's something you just, there'll be, I always say, 1 million questions, right? It's actually not 1 million questions, but there's, a lot of questions, thousands and thousands of questions that they have in these vaults of questions that are in a cloud somewhere. And, of those questions, if, any random 100 that came out and I took, I wouldn't get all 100 correct. There'll be a couple that are worded in some way that confuses me, or there's a topic I just don't know about for whatever reason or something. Like, there's going to be some on there that you just don't know. So don't kill yourself on stuff that becomes distracting. Keep rolling, keep moving. Like, if you work it out and you have, I actually can't remember what the numbers are. It's different for each exam, but let's say it's 2 minutes per question. If you work it out and you do a few practice exams where you time yourself to about a minute or so, and then given the anxiety of being the actual exam and maybe a slightly different way that they're written or something like that, you sort of give yourself a little more time than that on the actual exam. You'll have plenty. It'll work out. And if it's not working, jump on to the next one. The big thing here, and I know this is exactly not what you were looking for, and I apologize, but the big thing here is you have to try really hard not to worry about it. If you're worried about it, you're going to be wasting energy. You're going to be spinning your wheels. What you want to do is just kind of roll through it and have a sense of the timing by having practiced it. Practicing is huge. So you want to get used to, how long does it take you? Literally time yourself on some practice exams and just get a feel for it. Come up with some of the ways that you like approaching questions. Like, sometimes I know some people like to look at the answers first and then read the question because if they feel like it allows them to focus when they look at the question. Other people find that confusing, and so they don't want to do that. What do you want? Like, find your system that works for you. And the sort of in terms of the timing, you just start moving through it. Have your expectation of how fast you should be going through. Don't look at it every question. Have a sense every 5 questions or something like that. And once you've gone through, say, 15 or 20, stop looking, because you're either on the pace or you're not. And you don't need to keep looking. It's okay. Like once you feel like you're in the right track, don't think about that part anymore. Just focus on the questions. The one caveat that I will say, and this is another big one that you need to decide about how you want to approach it, is with the case studies. Now, we didn't really talk about case studies today, but the quick version of that is some grouping might be 10 questions, might be 15 questions. There might be 1 case study. There might be 2 case studies. will be those questions will be grouped together with a bunch of specific information that you have to respond to for that group of questions. The other 80 questions or 60 questions or 100 questions or whatever, depending on the exam, will just be regular multiple choice, just standalone questions. And there's a really interesting question that everybody should find their own opinion about whether you should do the multiple choice ones first and then get to, which is I think how it's physically laid out, and then get to the case studies, do the case studies second. And there's some reasons to do it that way. The other way to do it is to jump down, do the case studies first, and then go back up and do the multiple choice. And the reason this is sort of an interesting question is, like, for me, my worry, if I was taking the exam now, my big worry would be if I was doing the case study first, I know that I would start reading the code. I'd start reading all those little pieces of information that they give you. I would just be reading them because I'd begin interested and I'd start to wonder why they have me reading this, and I'd be getting all into it. Whereas if I did it last, I would have the pressure of, hey, don't get into it. You got 30 minutes left. Answer the damn questions. And so for me, because of my personality, it makes total sense for me to start with the multiple choice and then get to the case studies when I get to them. But I've talked to a bunch of folks who actually felt exactly the opposite because they really wanted to feel comfortable. They had time to look through the material and that they felt that they could just blitz through the multiple choice if they had to. So that's a really important one to think about from a strategy standpoint and have an opinion so that when you're going into the exam, you're not thinking about it then. You already know what you're going to do.
That's a great point. There's a lot of great stuff there. And the other thing that you and I often talk about is, remember, every single question is only worth 1 point. So there's no difference between the case studies that you're not worth more points.
Right. So if there's 12 questions for a case study, that's 12 points total. And you're going to get a bunch of them even if you miss a couple. And it's okay. You don't have to get every single one in the case study to get all those points. Right? So the big takeaway is, try not to fret about it. I know that's screw you, Mike, I know is what you're saying right now. But really, try not to fret about it because it's just you're just taking the exam and hopefully it works. And frankly, if it doesn't, big deal, we take it again.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. So many questions just sort of pouring in here, but unfortunately we're at time, so we're going to move on. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Our next ARE Live podcast, we will again use a mock exam to review issues related to project planning and design, one of the exams we were just talking about. I just posted the link to register for that podcast in the chat box. So go over to... go over there and you can log in. Or you can just go to blackspectacles.com/podcast to sign up. To learn more about our ARE exam prep curriculum, you can go to blackspectacles.com where you can try out any of our course videos. And as I always like to say, if you want your boss to pay for your membership, be sure to visit blackspectacles.com/firms.
And you should absolutely get your boss to pay for it.
Yeah, if they're not paying for your membership, I don't understand why. To learn more about any of our firm memberships for firms of any size. But if you are like many people whose boss isn't paying for it and you're ready to start preparing for the ARE right now, you can use coupon code PA112119YT to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your ARE exam prep membership. Now the fun part, holy smokes, we had 24 folks who got it right.
Told you.
So let's see. These first 4 or 5 here, they actually calling them out. Their firms have a firm license. So Gabriella from Smith Group, Aaron from Fitzgerald and Associates, Jacqueline from SCB, Jen from Beyer Blinder Bell, Rancelina from Rogers McCagg Architects, Planners, and Interior Designers. You guys will all be getting a T-shirt, and thank you for being Black Spectacles members or firm members. And then going down the list, Corey from Plunkett Racish Architects, Mary from Canon Design, Molly from Greer, A from Tash, Marcella from Harlan McGee, Kelly from LGA, Esther from Danois. Somebody put Z and their firm was FA. So I don't know what that means, but congratulations,
Congrats,
Z,
yeah,
you
way to go.
won. Tanya from CUA, Christine, Leo, you didn't put a firm, so I don't know where you're from. David Atelier, Carolina from QAM, Carolyn from Newport, Angela from Angela Inzerillo, I said that wrong. Emily from ZJMZ, John, Kyle from Jones, and Hadu John Day from Kasia Arc. That's so hard. This is the worst. I can't do this. But anyways,
Don't we have somebody here who can actually handle this job?
All 24 of you, you're going to get an email from us, which will set you up with a free T-shirt. So we're excited, and thank you guys for following along and submitting your answers in advance. Tomorrow we're going to email everybody a follow-up about today's live broadcast. So please let us know what you think. Share any suggestions you may have. And in particular, if you have any ideas or things you would like us to talk about, you'd like to learn more about, put your ideas in there. I promise that we read every word that you write and use them to tune our next episodes. So thanks for watching.